Okay, I'm torn today between two lecture topics. My plan had been to give a lecture on the basic overall circumstances of thinking about the history of the 20th century. And that is what I'm going to do. However, this morning in my reading, I discovered that knit garments did not appear in China until the early 20th century. Before that time, they would cut cloth and sew it together for socks, had no sweaters, so forth. And then when knit garments came in, it had a big impact upon clothing in China. Unlike the sewing machine, which did not, because the type of stitch that you had in a Singer sewing machine was a lock stitch. The Chinese used a chain stitch, and they sewed their garments with much finer stitching than they got from a Singer machine, and the Singer machine was too expensive. So unlike other parts of the world where the export of Singer sewing machines revolutionized the making of clothing, in China this was not so much the case, at least not in anywhere like the volume and immediacy of impact that you found elsewhere. On the other hand, the importation of the practice of knitting did have great impact, because knitting could be done at home. You could sell the products, and you had, for the first time, knit socks in China. And by the post-1911, so the revolutionary period in China, you began to have things like knit sweaters or vests, and the old padded, quilted winter jacket begins to be supplanted by knitted wear, which of course also implies wool, which had not been a major part of the Chinese textile profile in earlier times. China primarily used cotton, silk, and hemp, but not wool. Wool, of course, implied sheep, and then there's a question of where sheep, blah, blah, blah. So obviously something that's going to interest me a great deal more than probably anyone else in the world. And then at lunch, I brought it up with my learned colleagues. And we got into the question of, well, when did knitting spread elsewhere? Like, when did knitting come into the Islamic world or the Middle East? And that got into the issue of wearing socks for prayer. You have to wash your feet, so you have to take your shoes and your socks off, but then you can put the socks back on. Of course, your socks are not always the cleanest garments you have, but you put them back on, or else you put them in your pockets with the dirty end sticking out. And so I was trying to find out if there were any hadith about the Prophet's view of socks, or whether socks come in later on. And the whole question of the world historical impact of knitted socks seemed like something that would be appropriate for the sorts of lectures that I am inclined to give. But I decided not to. And yet there's a link between that topic and what I am going to lecture on, which is the nature of 20th century history. All of the remaining chapters in the book deal with the 20th century, and, actually the ultimate chapter deals with post-20th century, but I'm not requiring you to read that one. And that's a big chunk of a book of this size, and seems to be, I suppose, in most people's minds, proportional to the importance of the 20th century in history. And yet when I did a quick count of the 60 to 70 people listed in the Columbia Catalog as historians in the Department of History, that includes historians from Barnard and from the East Asian Languages and Cultures Department, I found that approximately half of the tenured professors here in history have written substantially or primarily on 20th century history. And yet in the world history textbooks, if you have, say, 4 chapters out of 36 devoted to the 20th century, that's 1/9, not 1/2. In terms of the actual historical profession then, the near past seems to be, to loom in a much more important fashion than the more distant past, even when the more distant past, let's say, is no farther away than 1850. Now, the one obvious explanation of this would be that we know what happened before 1850, but we're still masticating the 20th century to try and find out what happened. And therefore, what goes up to the late 19th century is kind of a homogenized given. This is what history is. And then what happens since the late 19th century is still up for grabs. I have talked before about my concern about a premature canonization of world history along exactly these lines, that people will come away with the idea that everything is known in a fairly compact, readable form for world history up until fairly recent times. And then we get into the interesting stuff. I've tried to point out, both last year and this year, that this is far from true, that almost every phase of human history is summarized in a brief, inadequate fashion in the textbooks that we have on world history, and that there are more stories, more turning points, more, aspects to look at the history from than you would ever draw from reading a world history textbook. But those earlier times no longer attract so many historians. Now, when I say no longer, I'm thinking of the history of history writing. I mean, there was a time, for example, when the history of the Roman Empire was terribly important for a lot of historians. We're talking about the era of Edward Gibbon in the 18th century. When the notion of something that happened many centuries before loomed as important because it was a kind of model for what could happen, in a more proximate future. So we get to a Napoleonic period where the Roman Empire is actively remembered in styles and furniture and symbolism, as opposed to the American Republic, where it's the Roman Republic, not the Empire, that is seen as being sort of at the root of civility, and someone like George Washington is compared with Cincinnatus as the great warrior who comes out of a bucolic background to save Rome and then goes back to the farm again. So there were times when earlier history was selectively emphasized and where you found comparatively little interest in contemporary history. And indeed, you had historians who were perfectly willing to dispute the fact, dispute the assertion that things in the recent past were part of history. They were part of living experience. The people who had participated were still alive. One waited for their memoirs. But history wasn't necessarily to be written about those recent events. There are always some historians who did, who after the French Revolution write a history of the French Revolution. But there were others who felt very strongly that the job of the historian was to study earlier things. In my particular field of Middle Eastern history, it became very, very clear in the 1970s and 80s in particular that most of the people who studied the history of the Middle East did not study, did not think about, and did not want to be asked about recent Middle Eastern affairs. If you studied in my field, you're expected to know what happened to Muhammad on Tuesday in early November of 6/11, and then what happened the next day. I mean, we have a work called the Annali del-Islam, the Annals of Islam, that really goes on a day-by-day basis, compiled by the Italian compiler Leone Caetani. And it was really felt you needed to know the 7th century. The 17th century was of no interest, but you needed to know the 7th century. So people like me studied the 7th century. I wrote my senior thesis as an undergraduate about the life of Muhammad, because after all, isn't that where we all have to start? To write about the 20th century, however, it was felt that that wasn't the job of a Middle East historian. Maybe a diplomatic historian or a historian of European imperialism, but somehow that was outside our remit. I recall in the 1970s, a French diplomat stationed at the UN who would come over to the Middle East Institute here and attend brown bags and seemed to be very interested in the talks that she heard. And I asked her, when you're back in Paris, you seem so interested in what the Middle East speakers are in our series. When you're in Paris, who do you talk to among the Middle East experts to get scholarly advice on what's going on in the Middle East? She said, we talked to Maxime Rodasson. I said, yeah, okay, fine. And then who else? I said, only him. No, nobody else will talk to us. They all think that everything important in the Middle East happened hundreds of years ago, and they don't follow affairs. We now have a new generation of people who are deeply imbued with the 20th and 19th centuries of Middle Eastern history. But this is a very recent phenomenon. So it is not axiomatic that the century that is most proximate to the time that when someone is teaching or writing is going to be the one that draws the most historical attention. And yet, the 20th century clearly draws much more historical attention than any other period or any other period of history at the present time. So is there something special about the 20th century that warrants this? Or is this just part of the sociology of the historical profession? Well, I'd argue it's not the latter, because when you look at books that are written for the general public dealing with history, you do have occasional outstanding books that deal with the period, say, before 1850. But not that many, whereas we have a huge number of books that deal with recent American history in particular. I have a colleague at a college in Pennsylvania who was coming up for tenure, and she asked, do I need to have a book written? And she was told, no, you have to have 3 articles published in peer-reviewed journals, because that will show that your scholarship is good. She said, well, why not a book? That's what everyone else requires. I said, well, anybody can publish a book. And everyone in her department was an American historian. And of course, you can publish anything about American history and have people read it. You don't have to go through a university press or something. So the recent history is more interesting now than recent history was, I would suggest, in 1850 or 1750 or 1650. Be happy to debate anyone on that, just not today. So what is it about the 20th century? In the first place, you have many historians who have fallen into the habit of talking about either a long or a short century. So you'll have people say, well, we'll talk about the long 19th century. That means the history of everything up until World War I in 1914. And because they'll say, well, everything before that is really simply a kind of unchanging continuum from what you have in the previous century or two. Or you'll have someone who talks about, say, the long 18th century. Goes from, say, 1730 up to 1850 or so. So the notion that the round numbers that denote a century are always dominant in the thinking of the historian. That really doesn't hold up. But then neither does this arbitrary notion that you can simply designate the length of a century. So for example, the long 19th century that goes up to World War I, if you were a Russian experiencing a revolution in 1905, an Iranian experiencing a revolution in 1906, Turks experiencing a revolution in 1908, you might feel that actually the 20th century, starting in 1900, was an important time because it was the pre-revolutionary moment. So that the notion of a long 19th century feeds in particular into the very the traditional portrayal of history as being primarily the history of Europe and its outliers elsewhere, like the United States, Canada. So, nevertheless, it is a century. I had proposed at one point to Columbia University Press, I've mentioned this in this class before, that I would edit a history of the 20th century, the Columbia history of the 20th century. And that book was published to no acclaim. And part of the reason it had no acclaim was that it did not have a dominant narrative thread. My premise was, what are the ways in which human life categorically has changed in the course of the 20th century that sets that century apart from the earlier centuries? And so I would pick topics like transportation or communications or popular culture or socialism, scientific discovery, and I got people to write chapters of sort of mixed quality on each of those topics. But I never told the story of World War I. I never told the story of World War II because I was unwilling to assume that in the long sweep of things, those would end up being the most important stories. I was thinking in the sense of trying to write a book or edit a book that would read well in 2100. Yeah, that wouldn't look shallow or biased or off base from 100 years perspective. It would not be overtaken by historiographical fashions or ideological or economic changes in the world. And I don't expect to be around in 2100 to see how well the book holds up, but I'm still happy that I carried out the project. But as I look back on the project, and I look at people who work on 20th century history, one of the things that's increasingly evident to me is that among historians, you have a division between what I would call stakeholders and non-stakeholders. Stakeholders are people for whom there is a consequence to their historical writing that goes beyond simply the padding of their bibliography or the pleasing of their immediate family. That there's a longer-term significance to the work. Non-stakeholders, by contrast, would be people who are intellectually drawn to the past and to the myriad ways of studying the past and the myriad sources of information, both public and arcane, that can contribute to writing a story of something that happened in the past. Well, that might not seem to be a hugely important difference, but it came to my mind many years ago when I was teaching at University of California, Berkeley for a couple of years. And I got to know an eminent Assyriologist named A. Leo Oppenheim. Oppenheim was interested in my work on the history of camel saddles. I was interested in his long career as directing the Chicago Akkadian Dictionary Project, which was designed to make available every word in the Akkadian language with its sources and meanings and so forth. The project has now been completed. Oppenheim died while I was at Berkeley. And his one big synthetic work was called Ancient Mesopotamia. And in the preface to the work, he says, I've named this book Ancient Mesopotamia, a portrait of a dead civilization. And he said that it's terribly important for him to regard ancient Mesopotamia as being dead. That there's no remnant of it. There are no Akkadian speakers left. There are no Sumerian speakers left. Nobody writes in the cuneiform script that was used at that time. All of the cities are in ruins. The memories are all gone. He said, if I think of that civilization as being dead, then I can take what we would now call a forensic view of it. I can take it apart, I can look at every portion of it, and I can appraise every portion of it relative to its own view of itself as portrayed in the other surviving sources. And the example he gave that was striking to me was a comparison between the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we still read in English translation, and Akkadian texts and samples devoted to the divination by the livers of sheep. He said we have, I can't remember how many, but like 4 or 5 cuneiform texts that contain what is still legible, what is still extant of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But we have hundreds and hundreds of texts that tell how to tell the future from looking at the liver of a slaughtered sheep, including clay models of livers so that you can see and handle in your class, here's what your sheep liver will look like. And here on this lobe, you'll find, whether it's going to rain tomorrow. And here in this other lobe, you'll find out how long the king will live, things like that. And he said, how could I possibly give greater significance to the Epic of Gilgamesh than to divination by the liver of sheep, when it's very clear that the people who actually lived at that time were much more interested in divination by sheep's liver than they were in the Epic of Gilgamesh. At the same time, he had a age mate who was the great authority on the Sumerians, who had been the earliest of the peoples in ancient Mesopotamia. His name was Samuel Noah Kramer. And Kramer's book, The Sumerians, is a companion, in a sense, to Oppenheim's book on ancient Mesopotamia. And you look at Kramer, what you find is that in virtually every chapter, and sort of in capital letters in the conclusion of the book, he specifies what of the Sumerians remains with us today. What is the heritage of the Sumerians? 360 degrees in a circle. We get that from the Sumerians. Various other things come from the Sumerians. And Oppenheim would have thought that this was simply foolish. That the idea that the reason you study history is to find out what gifts or heritages survive is an inherently unbalanced view of history, because it's looking at yourself first. And it's saying, who am I, who are we, and how do we relate to this era in the past. So even though he was an ancient historian, I would class Kramer in a sense as a stakeholder, someone who felt that he was studying the ancient period in order to illuminate readers about how that ancient period contributed to today's civilization, today's intellectual outlooks. Many of the historians who deal with the period before the 20th century have that kind of viewpoint. Let's say they think that if they can tell a story that will illuminate something of particular significance for people today. Maybe it'll be at sort of a macro historical level like Hegel or Marx or Spengler or Toynbee. Maybe it will be at a micro level, dealing with just the life of one person. But you have many historians who will try to link whatever they're writing to today. And indeed, if you seek to publish a doctoral dissertation, you'll probably find that an editor at a press will say, this is a very publishable dissertation. Could you add a chapter about how it relates to 9/11? I have for a number of years taught a graduate seminar called Recent Trends in Middle Eastern History or Islamic History, in which we only read books published since, say, 2001 or 2002. And part of the question is, would those books be different if had it not been for 9/11? It turns out that 9/11 has affected the scholarship even for a much earlier period. Sometimes it's only in the introduction of the preface. Say, 9/11 was such a shock that it made me wonder what people felt like when Muhammad died. So let's go back to, it's sometimes completely facetious or untenable, but that sense that somehow there should be a linkage is often there. All right, most stakeholding is not of this kind of abstract fashion. Most of it has to do with more specific concerns about the impact of individuals, social groups, political entities, economic happenings, as they continue to affect our lives today, which is just fine. But the people who write this history often have a very clear stake in the whole thing. In other words, they're drawn to that story because of who they are and where their family is from. Sometimes it'll be fairly palpable, in which someone will be clearly writing history in defense of his or her people. Wanting to show that either as an Armenian, I am proving that an Armenian Holocaust occurred at the time of World War I, or as a Turk, I am proving that no Armenian Holocaust occurred then or at any other time. So many stakeholders are people who are, they wouldn't say that they have a program in particular. Some of them might. Some of them might say very clearly that they are trying to establish the truth, or recover the truth, or refute a whole packet of lies told by other historians, or to put their people or their tradition on the map, a map that they've been left out of, say like Kurds or Basques. So sometimes it's that kind of stakeholding. Sometimes it is situational. I mentioned the debate last time, the debate over Herbert Spencer, and how Richard Hofstadter in 1944 wrote a book on social Darwinism in America, identifying Herbert Spencer as the arch-racist paragon of social Darwinism, even though the term wasn't commonly used in the time of Spencer. Spencer probably never heard the term, and certainly would not have identified with the term. And then the argument over, is this something that Hofstadter wrote simply to correct the record, even though, in a sense, he was establishing a new interpretation of early 20th century in which racism was in existence and he was putting sort of a form to it? Or was this his left-wing anti-capitalist politics speaking? And that, of course, is the point made now by libertarians who are trying to resurrect Herbert Spencer as a spiritual ancestor of libertarian anti-socialist thought. The number of historians who have fought for the working class or fought to suppress the working class, each in the ideas and the vision of the other. The number is legion. People are drawn to these stories, as I say, sometimes because of their personal, family, or religious or national backgrounds, sometimes because of their ideological commitments, sometimes out of a kind of quixotic desire to set some sort of record straight. But in any case, I think one of the great attractions of 20th century history is that the things that happened in the 20th century seem to be so much with us that we can still have time to correct, still have time to restructure, still have time to mold that story that underlies our contemporary reality. I recall a discussion we had in an author's meeting about whether we should fold World War I and World War II into a single chapter and call it, say, 30 Years' War, in which you had an interlude of the Great Depression. First the follies of the 1920s and the Great Depression, and then you had another war. And we kind of concluded, no, that's premature. People don't want to lose World War I and World War II. And yet, in the long run, when you look back at the 30 Years' War of the 16th century or the 100 Years' War between England and France, when you look back at other wars that are denominated by periods of time, you find that often there were substantial interludes of peace in the midst of those times, or that all of the parties were not fighting all of the time, and that some historian at some point made that decision. Let us fold it all together and call it the 30 Years' War. Certainly nobody living through the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics in the 16th century thought they were living during the 30 Years' War. It was, they were at war with Germany or the Pope or Sweden or some foe, but how that war would ever be designated was very unclear. So when it comes to World War I, of course, World War I was not called World War I. There's been kind of a search for who was the first person to call it World War I. Because the only way you could call it World War I is if you were postulating a World War II. By the 1930s, you had people speculating about a Second World War. But I don't know who was the first person to use the term World War I. If you go back to the encyclopedias of that time, you'll find it's always called the Great War. It becomes World War I only in the aftermath of World War II or in the event of World War II. And so then it seems likely that there will be another terminology. For example, to call it the 30-year European Civil War. The term world is very problematic. In both wars, there were many parts of the world that were affected primarily in their trade relations. That is to say, they were selling goods to combatants, or they were colonial areas that were providing goods for combatants. Most of the people in the world certainly did not participate in World War I. And even World War II left significant parts of the world minimally affected, at least by the direct experience of war. And of course, one of the areas of the world that was least affected by the actual experience of war was North America. The United States fought in the two wars, but nobody attacked the United States. The war wasn't fought on American soil. And, well, I shouldn't say nobody attacked the United States. I guess Pearl Harbor has to count. But it was not American mainland. So then you have the question of why do we call these world wars? Could we just as easily talk about a European Civil War? A first one between conservative monarchies and comparatively dysfunctional constitutional monarchies or democratic monarchies. But even then, there are participants who don't fit in very well to these categories. You know, Montenegro is one of the allies of the British and the French, and it was defeated early on, and that was the end of Montenegro. Bulgaria and Romania come into the war. But in most narratives, the war boils down to what happens in Europe, and in particular, what happens on the Western Front, that is, say, the trench lines between German and French, British, and eventually American forces in France, or what happens on the Eastern Front in Poland and in the northern part of the Balkans. What happens elsewhere is usually left out of the narrative. So in other words, you have a substantial history of war in East Africa during World War I. The Germans had a colony, German East Africa, what we later call Tanganyika, and then it becomes part of Tanzania. They had troops in German East Africa. The British sent a force to British East Africa to fight against the Germans. And the war went on there in a, not a desultory fashion, because there really was fighting and there certainly were casualties, but in a fashion that was so far removed from the headlines that we now more or less forget it. But it had its interesting points.
The African Queen.
The African Queen is the movie that comes out of that war, and probably that's what most people know about that war. But the Germans armed black African citizens. They trained them to be soldiers, using a word that was used earlier by the Italians in their conquests of Ethiopia and Libya for native troops, called askaris, simply an Arabic word meaning army or military. So in East Africa, the fight was largely between black Africans and British forces who used Africans to carry their goods. They did not give them weapons, but they felt the only way you could campaign was to have a bunch of people carrying all of your camp goods and your ammunition and everything. So they had tens of thousands of local Africans were employed by the British as porters or bearers, whereas the Germans used the Africans for as warriors. And they actually did extraordinarily well. There weren't that many of them, but not surprisingly, they knew their way around the terrain a lot better than the British did. And they had a very good German commander. And that war continued pretty much through the entire period of World War I, and then was more or less forgotten. Similar things happened elsewhere. In other words, forgotten centers of the war. So we end up with this narrative of machine guns and poison gas and tanks and the first warplanes. Belgium lost more pilots in training than they did in combat because the planes had this reasonable likelihood of simply stopping, the engine stopping and then crashing to the ground. But that becomes the story of the war. The Japanese occupy German territories on the Chinese mainland. It's an important fact for Asian history. But by and large, that is the way the story is told. Since almost everyone is dead who fought in the war, the issue of being a stakeholder has pretty much vanished. The British Empire, all the empires are gone. You'll still have a few conservative historians who are eager to recollect how great European empire was, but by and large that notion that there was a stake in World War I has gone. Not true of World War II, where the issue of having a stake in what happened during the war is still very, very much alive. Now, how do historians handle this? One of the most eminent books on World War I, published in 1962, was by Barbara Tuchman, and it was called The Guns of August. Barbara Tuchman was a professional journalist who made her fame as what we in the profession consider a lay historian, i.e. a historian who makes more money than we do. And she was primarily interested in the high command of the French and British armies and how badly they thought about the preparations for the war and how badly they prosecuted the war in the month of August of 1914 when the war began. It's a very good book. It's a very good read. Completely different would be a book by a French historian, Marc Ferro, a book called in English The Great War, published in 1969 in French and then a few years later in English. Ferro, on the one hand, was a man more on the left and is very concerned with why did the socialist leaders not stop the war? Was this war a great failure of the socialist vision that had become so important in so many European countries in the decades leading up to the war? But he also is interested, as a historian of the Annales School, in a kind of social history of the war. Annales School meaning that characterized by the French journal Annales Économie de Société Civilisation, or Annales ESC for short. So Ferro found it intriguing that when the war broke out in 1914, there was so much eagerness. Enlistment was brisk in virtually every country. Part of it had to do with the conviction that the war would be over very quickly, which was thought in all countries. Part of it was a very strong patriotism. Part of it was a palpable interest in achieving manhood. The idea that in your generation, this is the war, and if you are not in it, you have missed the great adventure of your generation. And so you had people who were not only eager to join the army, but were even more eager to be in a fighting unit and to be on the front lines. And diaries and journals talk about how thrilling it is. Finally going to go, we're finally going to confront the enemy. We'll have our baptism of fire and so forth and so on. Enormous enthusiasm for World War I. And he contrasts that with the zero level enthusiasm for World War II, except among the Germans, who were taking revenge for the unfair peace that had been imposed upon them at the end of World War I, and who were fired by a nationalist ideology that was far more substantial and effective than anything ever seen in Europe before. Though maybe in the Napoleonic period, I'm not sure. So I said, how you have these two wars, one people enter into with enthusiasm, and the other people enter into with feelings of almost universal dread. They volunteer. They want to do the patriotic thing. They want to be men. but there's no real notion that the war will be fast. And the size of the war is anticipated to be massive. So he relates that to a sense of risk. And he says that when you look at France, which is his primary point of departure, you look at France after 1910, you see a society that is in great ferment intellectually, socially, politically, and you see indications of it being a society that's very risk-prone. So he goes, for example, to the records of pawn shops. He finds that in the year or two immediately preceding the war, the willingness of people to borrow, to pawn things, went up markedly. Borrowing, of course, being a gamble that the future is going to be either better or more lucrative, or something will wipe out the debt. And he says that this economic willingness to take on risk led to people contributed to people seeing the war as being short and advantageous to them. That they would come out alive, they would be heroes, their country would be victorious. Even up to, say, through 1917, after 3 years of war, the censors in France prohibited the newspapers from using the word peace. And it was frowned on in conversation. If anyone used the word peace, they would be criticized by other people because the word was victory. No, we're not seeking peace, we are seeking victory. And it took a very long time for people to come around to the idea that stopping the fighting was what needed to be done. So you have a risk-prone population, or risk-prone populations, on the eve of World War I. Maybe Pharaoh doesn't speak for all countries, but certainly for France. Whereas on the eve of World War II, you have people who have been beaten down by the Great Depression for 10 years. And they see the war as a continuation of the gloom. No anticipation, of course, that World War II was going to rescue them from the Great Depression because of the economic stimulus, but rather that they were in a very gloomy mood when the war broke out. There are ways to measure this in the United States having to do with studying onomastic samples, but I'm not going to. I've laid that on you once before. I'm not going to go into it again, but it's what you can see very clear by certain quantitative measures of names, how people reacted to World War I, World War II, the Depression, and so forth and so on. A very interesting phenomenon. So Pharaoh was taking a sort of what nowadays we call a structural approach. Structuralism was very much in at that time, late 60s, into the 70s. The idea that when you looked at big events, you should be looking at underlying structures. Structuralism kind of faded in the 1990s, even in the 1980s, even though it had been voguish in many fields, anthropology, religion, folklore, history. The notion that the job of the scholar is to find underlying structures took a hit that it hasn't really recovered from. And that hit was, in part, supported by the work of Edward Said and the people who were so enamored of his work, that said that, you know, when you have a Frenchman who thinks that he is understanding the deep structure of how Amazon tribespeople operate, that is an Orientalism. That is a fabrication. It is something that the scholar is inventing for his or her personal edification, and consciously or unconsciously in inventing it, abetting the imperialist capitalist structure of things. And we shouldn't do that anymore. We should do something else, like we should spend our time tearing apart the work of the past generations of scholars. So post-structuralism came in, which was more interested in the examination of the discourse, of the way words are used and strung together in scholarly works, than in ferreting out new archives or new bodies of information. One of the products of this, I would argue, is that as we come down to today, some of the older ideas of trying to structure history have given way to a growing interest in what is generally called history from below, where you don't try and figure anything out. You simply try to assemble and juxtapose bits of information or text that relate to somebody. Not anybody of any importance, but just somebody. Maybe the first well-known text of this sort was The Return to Martin Guerre, written by Natalie Zeman Davis of Princeton 30 years ago, thereabouts. There have been a number of books recently that use this technique of looking at people of no significance and saying, we won't assert anything about the overall structure of what's going on in the history that they are part of. We'll simply look at their lives in that history. In this vein, there is a book that was just published last week, and that has been very well reviewed, and that I'm now 60% of the way through on my Kindle. By a historian named Peter Englund. It's called The Sorrow and the Beauty. And it is a history of World War I. Sounds like a movie, yes. When I worked for CBS once, the polling person said that whenever they poll the title of a movie for popularity, they always test it against the title, The Fire in the Wind, because apparently that is always the most attractive movie title ever, but nobody's ever made a movie called that. So they will simply say, well, how would you compare Tower Heist to The Fire in the Wind? And say, well, I want to go Fire in the Wind. You know, where's that showing? Tower Heist, you know. Saw it last night, wasn't very good. So it does sound like a movie title, but what Englund has done is quite fascinating. He has assembled a group of 20 or so individuals, none of them of any fame or any notoriety, who wrote journals or diaries or letters, or whose names appeared in dispatches and reports during World War I. And he has he tells the story chronologically, so that you have, January 17th, Maurice Rampal and his unit are told to go to replace a unit at point 321 on the line at Verdun. And then he describes how they go there. And they're going under the orders that you will replace the unit that is already there, and you will hold that piece of the line until you have lost 3/4 of your men. Then you'll be relieved by another unit. And that's exactly what happens. They go there, they have German bombardments and machine gun fire, and when they lose 3/4 of their personnel, another unit comes to be slaughtered in their place. It's an incredibly grim book. It has at least 5 of the 20 or so speakers are women. People who are in nurse or ambulance corps, or who are simply refugees who are caught up in the war and write about it. It includes people in the German army, people in the Russian army, people in the Ottoman army, people in the French army, Italian army. Very little about the English army, but some. I haven't gotten to the point where the Americans come in yet, so I don't know what the Americans will be like. And when you read this, it's very artfully put together. I mean, think of a Ken Burns documentary in which you never hear anything about Grant or Lee or Stonewall Jackson. You just hear about private soldiers or non-commissioned officers who are in the lower ranks, but woven together with the same sort of skill. And of course, you come away with a very different picture of this war. As the war comes out in this account, certain things are striking. One is, it was incredibly boring. Most people did nothing most of the time. They waited for something to happen. There's some poor soul who serves on the German battleship, the Helgoland, and he wants to be in a great naval battle, and his ship never goes to war. He finally has a battle. His ship fires 65 shells, is hit by 1 shell, and then they go back into port again. And all of his stories about how frustrating it is that he hasn't been in battle. Other people will have a very different approach to battle. Someone who never volunteers for anything in the French army, hoping that he will never be selected for anything dangerous, and tries his best to avoid ever being in a battle. Or another guy, an Italian-American who goes to Italy to serve in the Italian army, who, as he approaches his first battle, suddenly is seized by the idea that he doesn't want to kill anybody. A phenomenon that's pretty well attested in other wars. And so he goes into battle and he fires his gun because he has to, and he fires it into the air so he won't hurt anybody, thinking, well, maybe he won't be hurt in return. So then he finally is hurt in return and ends up in a hospital where he goes crazy and thinks that he has been destined by God to solve the war, so they put him in an asylum and eventually ship him back to the United States. In other words, these are not heroic people. Some of them are zealots, some of them are not, and they're all undergoing boredom and hardship, and the ubiquity of dead people is one of the most striking things. There are dead people all over the place. Now, we look at the grand numbers of how many people were killed in World War I. And we think, well, that's a huge number of people. And what is very clear in these accounts is that, half a dozen of those who were killed are right over there, and you can still see their faces and their bodies stink. And so the horror of the whole thing is very, very powerful. Everyone is seeing this as a Holocaust, as just a vast waste of life, or at least that is the impression you get on reading it. Particularly strong, of course, for the nurses and the ambulance people who have to deal specifically with the wounded. Wounds are described in great detail, how there would be special hospitals established out in the woods for men whose faces had been shot away because they were so gruesome to look at. They didn't want them to be where anybody could see them. And of course, the refusal of all the governments to release any figures about losses, and so on. So it's a very powerful book. Yeah?
Where did the second word come in as Viking, the beauty?
Because there are people who find glorious moments. And there are zealots. There are people for whom this is a magnificent experience. The book I compare it with is one that none of you should read. I can't recommend it, although I read it, but I have very low taste. And that is the recently published book, World War Z, which is the story of, in the same way, the story from below, of the memories of what happened during the Great World War against the zombies. Now, Z is for zombie, where the zombies almost destroyed the entire human population. And they're defeated. And so now this is a historian looking back and saying, what happened in the Great War against the zombies? It's not such a bad book. Actually, as zombie books go, I'd say it's better than Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. But Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is actually pretty good. No, thank you. So, an opportune moment. But one of the interesting comparisons is that the author of World War Z is particularly interested in conveying the horror of the Great Zombie War. Now, the zombies staggering about and limbs falling off and horrendously wounded, and they're biting you and so forth and so on. And Peter Englund's book is far more horrifying in talking about the reality of war. And it's interesting because we've had a vogue in this country for the last 25 years or so, maybe a little longer, for post-apocalyptic fiction, whether in movies or in novels or in comic books. And there simply aren't enough dead. It's striking that you have people who are trying to imagine most of the humans on the planet dying of something, a plague or poison gas or alien invasion or zombieitis or whatever it is. But the dead just don't show up very much. Whereas in World War I, it's the ubiquity of the dead and the horribleness of the loss of life that comes through in these snippets of visualization. So I find myself wondering, well, does Peter Englund have a stake in this? Well, is there some non-structural, non-metahistorical, non-geopolitical lesson he's trying to bring across? Is this fundamentally an anti-Holocaust book, or a book asking people to look at the loss of life everywhere, irrespective of national commitment or ideology or station in life and see that that the actuality of this kind of conflict is vastly worse than the imagining of the conflict. I recall a number of years ago reading a book called World War III that was a visualization of a British general of what would happen when the Soviets invaded Central Europe. And it had that characteristic of no dead people. And so I was thinking, well, is this part of a generalized, that is to say, non-Jewish specific sense of the horror of mass killing? And have we gotten to a point where we find this, peculiarly horrifying? And if so, is it something that's been reinforced by the American actions in Iraq or Afghanistan, where we hear so much about civilian casualties and so forth and so on? I don't know. But I think that Peter Englund, while writing a really, really deeply moving book, is a stakeholder in some sense, and is saying something about how we look at this sort of thing today in a sort of post-ideological, post-geopolitical, post-Holocaust world. Now, let me make one final remark. I chose to be a medieval historian specializing in the Muslim Arab world. I made that decision at the end of my freshman year in college, and that's what I trained to do. And one of the things that was most important to me then and ever since is that I wanted to be a historian who had no stake in the outcome. I never expected to teach about either the modern Middle East or the modern world. I was interested in knitting socks, or exporting rickshaws, or inventing a way to pollinate the vanilla plant. And in some ways, what you hope to do as a historian, or what you think you are good at as a historian, often gets overtaken by the world that you're living in. So as we go on to more 20th century history in the next final 3 weeks, I'm going to try and act like a stakeholder, but I'm very dubious that I really care. So anyway.